Are we live then?
Casey, are we live? Okay, good. Let's go. All right. I missed that.
Everyone, the subcommittee on water, oceans, and wildlife will now come to order. This subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on several water and wildlife related bills. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at this hearing is limited to the chair and the ranking member or their designees, and this will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of business, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository, and the address for that is hnrcdocs, D-O-C-S, at mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Otherwise, let's all be mindful of that and control our own microphones. Very important, all subcommittee members who've joined us in person today are required to wear a face covering when they are not speaking, per guidelines from the House Office of the Attending Physician. So I want to thank everyone in advance for doing that. I will ask you, since nobody but me is speaking right now, I'll ask you all to please respect that rule and put your masks on at this time. The committee has provided masks and hand sanitizer for those who don't have their own and has arranged for contact surface cleansing and for social distancing. These measures are intended to save lives, and they'll be enforced as required by the House Attending Physician. My hope, of course, is that every member of this committee would simply want to do this out of consideration for others in the room, both members and staff. So again, just a reminder, please, if you are not speaking, respect the safety and decorum rules of this House and wear the mask. I know that among those in the room today, we have people with underlying health conditions or people who have family members that have health profiles that put them at an elevated risk of contracting serious complications or even dying from COVID-19. If anybody thinks that they're too cool to wear a mask, it's even less cool to have to wear a ventilator. So please respect the rules. And I do want you to know that while I can't control what members may choose to do outside of this hearing room, I intend to enforce those rules today in this hearing. The way we'll do that is if you hope to be recognized at any point in this hearing, you will start complying with those rules right away. I say this to members of both parties, everyone in the room. If you want to be recognized at any time in this hearing room, this is your final warning to follow the rules and wear the mask unless you are speaking. All right. Now, the meeting today, I'll begin my opening statement. The meeting today is to hear testimony on several, let me get myself organized here. This is our subcommittee's first official legislative hearing since the start of the coronavirus pandemic. And I really want to thank everyone for being adaptable and flexible and resilient during these uncertain times. The hearing format that we're trying today is a new one for us. We're using a hybrid between an in-person and online hearing to allow for maximum participation at a safe distance. We're committed to the continued development and examination of legislation focusing on managing our nation's water supplies and protecting our oceans and wildlife. And on today's agenda, we will focus on 6 water and wildlife bills, half are Democratic bills, half are Republican bills. The first of these bills is H.R. 2871, the Aquifer Recharge Flexibility Act, introduced by Congressman Fulcher. This bill provides the Bureau of Reclamation and the Bureau of Land Management new authorization to allow the use of federal infrastructure and lands to recharge groundwater aquifers in the western United States. Many aquifers in the West are currently depleted, and stakeholders are increasingly interested in using surface water supplies to intentionally recharge these depleted aquifers. And while recharging those aquifers will be necessary, care must be taken to make sure that this new use of surface water for recharge is balanced with other water uses, including existing beneficial uses and environmental water needs, such as minimum in-stream flows for fish and wildlife survival. I look forward to hearing more about this bill today and the challenges and opportunities ahead on the aquifer recharge front. We'll also hear a bill that addresses a Bureau of Reclamation issue specific to Montana. This is H.R. 2492, the St. Mary's Reinvestment Act by Mr. Gianforte. It would increase the federal cost share for operations, maintenance, and repair to 75% for Reclamation's Milk River project in north central Montana, and it would make that share non-reimbursable. We have heard a lot about deteriorated conditions at this particular project and the desire for greater federal support for project repairs. So I look forward to hearing more about that bill as well. The last water bill that we'll hear is H.R. 3937. It's introduced by Mr. Newhouse and co-sponsored by the entire Washington State House delegation. The bill renames what is now known as the third power plant at Grand Coulee Dam to the Nathaniel Nat Washington Power Plant. This designation would honor both Nat Washington Sr. and his son, Nat Washington Jr. They were enthusiastic proponents of hydropower in the Pacific Northwest. Moving to the wildlife-focused bills, the first bill on our agenda is H.R. 1776, the Captive Primate Safety Act, introduced by Earl Blumenauer. This bill has already passed the House under suspension in a previous Congress. Now, currently, laws regarding primate pet ownership, including monkeys, chimpanzees, and others, vary by state and by city. And while these animals are very charismatic, the truth is they really should not be pets. Primates can carry diseases and can be highly aggressive, adding to the risks that they pose to public safety. So this bill specifically amends the Lacey Act, one of our oldest and most effective wildlife trade laws on the books, to eliminate the inhumane and dangerous pet primate trade. The next bill up for consideration will be H.R. 2264, the Bear Protection Act, introduced by Representative Ted Lieu. This bill was first introduced in a previous Congress by Senator Mitch McConnell and passed the Senate by unanimous consent. The Bear Protection Act fights against commercial poaching of bears for their internal organs, or viscera, to protect American bear species. And we're alarmed, of course, to hear that China's National Health Commission recently included bear bile as a recommended treatment for critical and severe conditions of COVID-19 cases, despite recent restrictions on wildlife trade and a lack of robust medical evidence to support the effectiveness of that substance in treating the virus. Bear poaching is a persistent problem that we must address. The final bill for consideration today is Chair Grijalva's H.R. 6761, the Murder Hornet Eradication Act. While America has been sheltering in place, the Asian giant hornet was not. This invasive hornet, more commonly referred to as the murder hornet, is the world's largest wasp. It can grow up to 2 inches in length, and it is notorious for destroying beehives and overtaking honeybee colonies within 90 minutes. These hornets were first sighted near the Canada and Washington state border in December 2019, and a second population was observed in Blaine, Washington in April 2020. We must protect our country's honeybee populations before these hornets spread any further. And so this bill authorizes financial assistance to states in need of detecting and eradicating these Asian giant hornets. Thank you all so much for being here today to discuss this legislation. I will now turn to Ranking Member McClintock. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by once again protesting the irregular process by which the committee continues to operate. A modified Zoom call is no substitute for the deliberative process of coming together and meeting, which the Congress is designed and intended to do. I'm gratified that a few more members of the committee are actually showing up for work, but the product of that work is not to be taken seriously until we return to the regular order of the House. Today, the subcommittee sort of meets to consider a number of bills concerning water and wildlife conservation. The simplest are H.R. 2871 by Mr. Fulcher and H.R. 3937 by Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Fulcher's bill allows for his state of Idaho and others throughout the West to use existing Bureau of Reclamation facilities and infrastructure to recharge underground aquifers. This bill protects surface water storage by specifically authorizing the use of excess capacity for diversion to aquifer storage in reclamation-owned conveyance facilities. Sadly, the bill specifically excludes California from this new authority to save himself the headache of dealing with California water officials. Hopefully, this legislation will offer yet another example between rational water policy and those of California's. Mr. Newhouse's bill simply renames a power plant at one of our nation's greatest treasures, the Grand Coulee Dam, after Nathaniel Nate Washington, who was instrumental in the construction of the dam. H.R. 2492 by Mr. Gianforte seeks to change the financing system to expedite improvements for a water system in his state. This legislation would change the allocation of cost for operation, maintenance, repair, and replacement of the Milk River project by requiring the federal government to pay 75% of all associated costs of the project. Now, the entire reclamation system was built on the fundamental principle that the beneficiaries of a water project should pay for that water project. This principle protects taxpayers from having to bear costs of projects from which they receive no benefits and assures that only those projects that are cost-effective can proceed. It's my hope the author will address this concern before proceeding to the full committee. H.R. 6761 by Mr. Gahalva establishes a grant program to assist states in eradicating the so-called murder hornet. This is an invasive species that attacks honeybee populations and merits federal concern and intervention. However, it does raise the question of why numerous other federal programs already on the books to combat invasive species have been ineffective in this case. We already have the National Invasive Species Council, which in 2017 reported spending nearly $2 billion of taxpayer funds across 9 federal agencies to combat exactly the kind of infestations addressed by this bill. If these bureaucracies are not doing the job for which they were tasked, we should consider reforming or eliminating them before setting up yet another bureaucracy to do the same thing. The remaining bills are well-intentioned measures that I'm concerned make the problems they seek to address worse and not better. H.R. 1776 by Mr. Blumenauer is a perennial for this committee that would deny USDA licensed and regulated zoos and animal recovery preserves the ability to access certain animals under the Lacey Act. These facilities are required to obtain a Class C exhibitor's license issued by the U.S. Department of Agriculture under the Animal Welfare Act and must abide by the AWA rules governing the housing, care, and feeding of their animals enforced through inspections by the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service Animal Care Division. The animal rights groups, this isn't enough, and they seek to deny these zoos access to certain animals entirely, stopping their good work. Finally, H.R. 2264 by Mr. Liu seeks to protect bear populations by banning the legal trade in bear viscera, a product in high demand in certain cultures. The goal is laudable, but unfortunately runs afoul of the law of unintended consequences. The taking of bears for this purpose is highly regulated to assure that bear populations are not ravaged by demand for this product. Banning the supply will not ban the demand, which assures the trade will be forced into an underground market where there is no regulation and no accountability. We debated this problem at great length during the discussion of the so-called Cecil bill, and the principles have not changed. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent for Mr. Gianforte to sit with the subcommittee and yield back.
I thank the ranking member. I will now introduce our witnesses. You'll notice that the administration is absent, of course, since all of today's bills fall under Department of Interior's jurisdiction. The administration was invited to participate, but despite our satisfying their request for the chair and ranking member to appear in person, they've now declined to testify in person or remotely, and instead have provided written testimony. It is a shame for the American people and a danger, I think, to our democratic process for the executive branch to not answer questions from Congress. And I hope that in the future, the administration will change its tune on testifying. But we will move forward and we'll continue our important work with or without the administration's participation. We'll begin our testimony starting with the lead sponsors on today's agenda. And that begins with Representative Earl Blumenauer of Oregon. He's the lead sponsor of H.R. 1776, the Captive Primate Safety Act. Welcome, Mr. Blumenauer. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Good to have you here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member McClintock. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you once again to try and enact the Primate Captive Safety
The
Act.
gentleman will just suspend for a moment. I want to remind members, it's a habit we all have to form, but the mask really needs to cover the nose and mouth in order to function. So bear with me and please respect that rule of safety and decorum. Thank you. You may continue, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The practice of keeping non-human primates as pets poses serious risks to their welfare as well as public health and safety. Contrary to the ranking member's assertion, this is not about eliminating the opportunity for primates to be in zoos. The focus here is on the trade for individuals for primates as pets. Most people cannot provide the special care, housing, and structure these animals require, putting their very welfare at risk. This behavior also puts humans at risk, either through transmission, zoonotic diseases, or due to serious harm. When primates reach adolescence, they will often demonstrate aggression towards those they perceive as having lower ranking members of their troop. When they're kept as pets, this means they can inflict physical harm on humans, such as children, friends, and neighbors. Some of the committee are familiar with the horrific circumstance that occurred in Connecticut. Charla Nash was brutally attacked by a chimpanzee in Stamford, Connecticut. The chimpanzee, Travis, was kept as a pet by her neighbor. Despite previous public incidents where this non-human primate displayed aggressive behavior, she was kept as a pet, despite being illegal in the state of Connecticut. Then one day, Charla had her face and hands ripped off by the chimpanzee and was left, as you can see, horribly disfigured. I brought the picture just to share with you what this means. This isn't a minor bite or a nip. This was a horrific injury that has left Charla forever scarred. Now, I'm happy to share that she was one of the first people to receive a full face transplant in 2011. They also attempted to perform a hand transplant, was rejected. She lost sight in an eye due to a disease that was transmitted by the chimpanzee. Now, these is an example of what happens as we inflict primates in areas where they don't belong. This legislation has passed the House of Representatives with overwhelming support under suspension of the rules in 110th and 111th Congress. We voted on this legislation in 2009, just a week after Charla Nash was attacked. Now, since this incident, Charla has gone on to heroically share her story with the American public and to be an advocate on the behalf of this legislation, including here in Congress. Yet Congress has yet to act, and Charla is not alone. Since 1990, approximately 300 people have reported being injured by primates kept by private individuals. And it's highly likely that many more instances go unreported. Some may argue that this legislation is unnecessary, that many states have laws in the books to restrict the practice, yet the laws vary widely from a complete ban on pet primates to a ban on specific species to some with no restrictions at all. The Captive Primate Safety Act would actually help strengthen the existing state laws and create a federal framework of protection, licensing, and outlawing the practice of trade in captive primates. It's time for Congress to finish the job that the House has started in the past, to finally extend the protections dealing with captive primates and do right by Charla Nash and help protect our communities. I deeply appreciate the committee permitting me to appear today in support of this legislation and hope that you will be able to act affirmatively and quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. We will now hear from Representative Gianforte of Montana, the lead sponsor of H.R. 2492, the St. Mary's Reinvestment Act. Mr. Gianforte, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member McClintock. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the committee today, and it's great to be back in natural resources. The Milk River Project is the most important infrastructure project in Montana. It's a source for clean water for Montanans along our High Line and for irrigation for over 121 acres of farms. But the 100-year-old project is in disrepair and getting worse. The recent failure of Drop 5 completely shut down the project and makes clear why we need to act now. The federal government should step up and reduce the burden to hardworking Montanans to bear for this project's repair and maintenance. The project was originally built by Bureau of Reclamation to provide supplemental irrigation water along the Milk River, but has evolved into a multi-use project which provides water for municipalities, recreational enthusiasts, and wildlife habitats. The critical water supply accounts for 70% of the average Milk River flows during the irrigation season and as high as 95% during severe drought, when natural flows in the Milk River often go to zero. Furthermore, the project provides water for the Blackfeet Nation, Fort Belknap Indian community, and numerous towns along the High Line, which spans the entire northern tier of Montana. Since I was first elected to Congress, I've consistently stated that this is the most important infrastructure in the state in need of repair. Many components of the St. Mary's project have exceeded their design life and are in dire need of repair and replacement. And now the system has failed and is shut down. Generally, water user systems are responsible for a portion of the maintenance. The St. Mary's users have a 75% cost share of any rehabilitation on the project, one of the highest cost shares among Bureau of Reclamation projects. The project users cannot afford to pay this 75%, particularly with the expansion of the uses of the water since inception of the project. I have introduced legislation to change the cost share on the project. My bill, the St. Mary's Reinvestment Act, will increase the federal cost share and reduce the water user's share to 25%, making it similar to other BOR projects. On May 17, 2020, Drop 5 of the St. Mary's Canal Conveyance Works project in northwest Montana had a catastrophic failure, which completely shut down the entire system. This failure jeopardizes the upcoming irrigation season for over 18,000 water users on the system. And you can see the photo behind me here shows Drop 5, and it is completely washed out at this point, and the system is shut down. As recently as the beginning of March, I was in front of the House Transportation Committee advocating for much needed repairs on this project. I'll continue to push for funding for the whole project, but for right now, we must immediately fix Drop 5 as well as the diversion and Drop 2 because of the immediacy of Drop 5 and Drop 2 and the diversion structure. My office has been working with BOR and our Senate colleagues to focus our bill on these immediate concerns. On a more positive note, I've received work this week that the local Joint Board of Control has already begun work on Drop 5 to repair it, with a goal to complete the construction this season. This decision that was made locally almost completely depletes the financial reserves of this local Joint Board of Control that coordinates the project without addressing what until recently seemed like the most urgent needs. The cost share still needs to be addressed, but there's hope along the High Line. I look forward to your questions and moving forward with my legislation. I thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gianforte. Appreciate that, Mr. Gianforte. The chair now recognizes Representative Fulcher of Idaho. He's the lead sponsor of H.R. 2871, the Aquifer Recharge Flexibility Act. Mr. Fulcher, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member McClintock, and thank you for scheduling this hearing, Aquifer Recharge Flexibility Act. It does feel good to be back, so thank you for that. Since I arrived in Congress, some of you on both sides of the aisle may have received some Idaho Spud products. Look kind of like this. And it's something that I call potato diplomacy. We're known for our potatoes in our state, and we're very proud of that. Ironically, we also have a lot of semiconductor exports, semiconductor production there, but they're still chips. So we got potato chips and microchips, okay? But that's a way that I try to just get to know people that I haven't met before. But in Idaho, we're very proud of those products and all the diverse crops that we grow. Agriculture is more than 20% of our state's economy, and it's critical to our prosperity. And as you know, to have dependable crops, we must also have dependable sources of water. Idaho is on the forefront of conserving our water as we look to get the most out of every drop as it winds through the canals and irrigation districts of our water delivery system. That's why our state government is leading the charge on aquifer recharge efforts. In 2015, Eastern Snake Plain aquifer water users came together to stabilize and rebuild the aquifer. These users decided to reduce their groundwater use by 240,000 acre-feet every year, and that's so that more can be used for recharge. At the same time, the state invested $20 million on infrastructure improvements to assist further efforts. But more can be done to conserve water and rebuild our Eastern Snake River Plain aquifer. This bill can optimize these recharge efforts by authorizing the use of federally owned facilities for aquifer recharge purposes while protecting their intended uses. At the same time, the bill authorizes canal rights of way across federal land and assists with other federal easements to help make aquifer recharge more efficient across the West. The bill also maximizes water use by allowing contract holders to use federal project water for aquifer recharge when it makes sense, and the bill encourages landowners to optimize recharge efforts by reducing federal red tape. I want to thank Trout Unlimited for their engagement on this issue and for working on language modifications to authorize the Secretary to work with the state-led advisory groups. And yesterday, I offered an amendment to the Rules Committee to H.R. 2, the Moving America Forward Act, that reflects these modifications. The amendment also reflects changes made to the Senate version of the bill, which was unanimously reported out of committee. Due to these changes and overwhelming bipartisan support, I'm hopeful the chairman and the full committee will support this bill in a future markup, as well as the inclusion of the amendment to H.R. 2 when the bill is brought to the floor. And finally, I ask unanimous consent to submit a statement by Rob Chase, and I think that's part of our packet today, chairman of the Idaho Water Resource Board, statement in support of the bill for the record. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Fulcher. Appreciate that, Mr. Fulcher. We'll now go to Representative Newhouse of Washington. This really is Alumni Day here at this subcommittee of the Natural Resources Committee. We've got a lot of our friends who used to serve with us, and I don't know if the viewing audience can see, but Mr. Newhouse has one of the coolest facial coverings. I'm not talking about his handsome beard, but it's good to have you, Mr. Newhouse. You are the lead sponsor of H.R. 3937 to redesignate the facility of reclamation of the Bureau of Reclamation located at Highway 155, Cooley Dam in Washington as the Nathaniel Nat Washington Power Plant. We look forward to hearing about your bill. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Huffman. It is good to be back in the Natural Resources Committee hearing room. And thank you very much for allowing me to be here with you and to bring up my bill to rename the third power plant at the Grand Coulee Dam after two individuals who were instrumental in the construction and planning of the dam, Nathaniel Nat Washington, as well as his son, Nathaniel Nat Washington Jr. And also thanks to Mr. McClintock for his work on this effort as well. As you know, the Grand Coulee Dam is the largest power station in the nation with a 6,809 megawatt generating capacity. The dam supplies an average of 21 billion kilowatt hours of clean, affordable, and reliable electricity to 11 states as well as Canada each year. Reservoirs from the dam are the backbone of the Columbia Basin Project, which supplies irrigation to 10,000 farms on over 671,000 acres of farmland in the Columbia Basin. In fact, the Grand Coulee Dam can truly be credited for establishing our way of life in central Washington, transforming what would otherwise be an arid desert into one of the most productive agricultural regions of the country. While communities throughout the Pacific Northwest reap the benefits provided by Grand Coulee, most are unaware of how the dam came to be or how the work of a father and a son changed our region forever. In 1908, Nat Washington Sr., a descendant of President George Washington's family, left his home in Virginia and established a homestead along the Columbia River, not far from where the Grand Coulee Dam sits today. Shortly after arriving in Washington, Nat Sr. was elected as Grant County prosecutor and the first president of the Columbia River Dam Irrigation and Power District. In this role, Nat Sr. played a key role in the conception, approval, and construction of the Grand Coulee Dam. Nat Jr. shared his father's passion for public service. After earning his law degree from the University of Washington, Nat Washington Jr. also served as Grant County prosecutor, and later in the Washington State Legislature for 30 years. During that time, Nat Jr. was instrumental in the development of several hydropower projects across the region, including the Columbia Basin Project, which is the largest water reclamation project in the United States, providing nearly $2 billion in economic benefits to the region each and every year. Again, I would like to thank you, Chairman Huffman, and Ranking Member McClintock, as well as the rest of the members of the committee, for having me today, for allowing me to speak on this important bill, and to recognize the contributions of these gentlemen, renaming the third power plant at Grand Coulee Dam after both Nathaniel Washington Sr. and his son, Nathaniel Washington Jr., will help honor their legacy as pioneers of Northwest hydropower. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I'll yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Newhouse. We will now hear from the chairman of the full committee, Representative Grijalva of Arizona, who is the lead sponsor of H.R. 6761, the Murder Hornet Eradication Act. Surely the most dramatic bill title of anything in his illustrious career. We're glad to have you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the ranking member for hearing H.R. 6761. I wasn't going to say its full title because it is rather dramatic, but and I appreciate you pointing that out, Chairman. Good morning, everyone, and I want to also echo the chairman's gratitude to our witnesses for their time with this committee and the information and expertise that they're bringing. I'm glad we're having this hearing on this bill, the Murder Hornet Eradication Act, and I'm delighted to have Dr. Michelle Samuel-Foe share her expert knowledge of invasive species and pest management with us today. Invasive species come at a huge cost, both to our wildlife and the economy. It's estimated that invasive species cost the United States $120 billion each year, and invasive species are the #2 contributor to biodiversity loss. Here in the United States, about 40% of species listed as threatened or endangered under ESA are directly impacted by invasive species. This is an issue that needs to be taken very seriously. My bill is modeled off the Nutria Education Act, a bill we passed under suspension earlier this year. My bill proactively creates a grant program through the Department of Interior and authorizes funds to support states in need of eradicating Asian giant hornets and protecting pollinators, particularly honeybees, which would be severely threatened if this invasive species established populations in the United States. Most importantly, this bill is about getting a head start on an obvious problem before it becomes too late and unmanageable. This is the kind of approach we should always be taking rather than relying on denial or any anti-scientific thinking. Even still, as a whole, we need to take a more comprehensive look at our invasive species management. So I'm very much look forward to hearing from Dr. Samuel Fo's testimony on this subject. And I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes the testimony from members. We will now move to our witness panel, number 2. And the first witness on this panel will be Ms. Laura Zemer, Senior Counsel and Water Policy Advisor at Trout Unlimited. She'll be testifying on HR 2492 and HR 2871. After Ms. Zemer, we will hear from Dr. Michelle Samuel Fu, Assistant Professor of Biology at Alabama State University and President of the Southeastern Entomological Society of America, also former President of the International Association of Black Entomologists. She'll be testifying on HR 6761. And then following her, we will hear from Mr. Gordon Batchelor, Executive Secretary of the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, Incorporated. He'll be testifying on HR 1776, HR 2264, and HR 6761. And then finally, our last witness will be Mr. Michael Sutton, former president of the California Fish and Game Commission. And Mike will be testifying on HR 1776, HR 2264, and HR 6761. And Mr. Sutton, I'm looking forward to hearing from you virtually. My preference is always to see you on one of our great California rivers with our fly rods, but we're glad that you're participating remotely and safely in this hearing as well. Let me remind all of our witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, for our witnesses, the timer is going to show 5 minutes and it will count down, turning orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses jointly pin the timer on their screen. Hopefully you've figured out how to do this using the WebEx technology, but if you haven't, you may want to figure that one out pretty quickly. Pinning that timer will help you a lot. And then switch over to active speaker view with the thumbnail so that you can view the hearing room. To our witnesses, after your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise, and I will also allow the entire panel to testify before we bring it back to questions from members. The chair now recognizes Ms. Zemer to start our testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Laura Zemer in Bozeman, Montana. Thank you for the invitation to testify today on behalf of Trout Unlimited. The two water bills before the subcommittee today arise from the West's long history of irrigation in arid lands. These bills show the way to build healthier watersheds while upgrading irrigation infrastructure and innovating water management. My testimony today is grounded in Trout Unlimited's pragmatic, place-based work in Idaho and Montana over 2 decades. The work has built lasting partnerships with ranchers and irrigators to restore rivers while sustaining working lands. The Aquifer Recharge Flexibility Act removes some of the legal barriers to using the Bureau of Reclamation's vast infrastructure of reservoirs and canals for aquifer recharge. While the act applies westwide, except for California, it is Idaho's Aquifer Recharge Challenge that informs the bill. Navigating the conflicts between surface water users and groundwater users of the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer has taken decades. Over 20 years ago, the state of Idaho applied for new water rights for aquifer recharge. Creation of the multi-stakeholder environmental resources and technical working group helped resolve protests filed on the state's new water right applications. The working group has a formal charter, membership, and process that was agreed to as part of the settlement of the water right protests. The 2 primary issues tackled by the working group are first, preventing depletion of winter base flows, and second, leaving enough spring high flow events to maintain channel and floodplain health. Trout Unlimited and the Henry's Fork Foundation bring fisheries expertise to the diverse interests of the working group, but it is the group's commitment to a process of dialogue, learning from each other, and willingness to test drive new approaches that is central to its success. Trout Unlimited and Idaho's congressional delegation have agreed to language recognizing the value of multi-stakeholder groups like Idaho's working group. Trout Unlimited appreciates Representative Fulcher's leadership and supports incorporation of this language. Our experience in Idaho is that engaged dialogue and collaborative problem-solving works. Our experience is also that reclamation would benefit from other state-led working groups to monitor and assess aquifer recharge activities. The second water bill of today's hearing is the St. Mary's Reinvestment Act. The St. Mary River arises in Glacier National Park and flows north through Canada to Hudson Bay. Bull trout are native to these cold mountain waters. Bull trout's dependence on a high-quality water and connected habitat resulted in being listed under the Endangered Species Act over 20 years ago. The plentiful mountain waters of the St. Mary River were also eyed by early settlers of Montana's eastern plains. An ambitious 29-mile canal to bring mountain waters to the plains Milk River was among the first 5 projects of the Reclamation Service when it was first created in 1902. Bull trout passage at the diversion and entrainment into the canal have been a concern since its listing under the ESA. The opportunity to incorporate modern insights about fisheries in redesigning aging infrastructure creates a win-win for farms and fish. As we've heard, the St. Mary's Canal needs an immediate win-win. Last month, a portion of the canal called Drop 5, where the canal loses elevation, completely washed out, and Drop 2 is not far behind. TU supports the discussion among Montana's congressional delegation to replace the diversion structure and Drops 2 and 5 along the canal at a 75% federal cost share. This would replace the current text of the bill. If federal funding is used to repair the failed 29-mile canal built more than a century ago, it makes sense to incorporate the already redesigned diversion and fish screen as part of the infrastructure upgrade. In conclusion, the water bills in today's hearing, amended as I've described, illustrate the upside of looking at Western water through a lens focused on multi-benefit projects. Thank you, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Zemer. The chair now recognizes Dr. Samuel Fu for 5 minutes to testify.
Good morning, Chairman, ranking members, and other distinguished members of the U.S. House of Representatives, Committee on Natural Resources, Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife. My name is Michelle Samuel Fu. I'm a faculty member at Alabama State University in the Department of Biology. I'm an entomologist by training, and I'm a past president of the International Association of Black Entomologists. And one correction, I'm the president-elect of the Southeastern branch of the Entomological Society of America. Thank you for the opportunity today to address the committee on the very important issue of H.R. 6761 that would see funding established to provide financial assistance to states in eradicating the Asian giant hornet. My comments today are intended to provide this subcommittee with a better understanding of the potential devastating impact of the Asian giant hornet to U.S. agriculture, and in particular our honeybee pollinators, and also to emphasize that we have an opportunity to help ward off the threat of this invasive species. On May 2nd, 2020, the New York Times ran an article entitled, "Murder Hornets in the U.S., the Rush to Stop the Asian Giant Hornet." While this headline was a bit sensational in nature, the article did do a good job of alerting consumers and other stakeholders about an invasive species that had recently been discovered inside of our borders. It brought widespread attention to a topic that those of us who work in the world of agriculture recognize as a serious potential threat. First, I'd like to note that what is being called the murder hornet is actually the Asian giant hornet, Vespa mandarinia, and a large dead Asian giant hornet was found in Washington State in December of 2019, and since then there have been 2 additional reported findings to date. We know that it's the world's largest hornet with a reported size of up to 2 inches and a wingspan of up to 3 inches. Its sting can evoke an allergic reaction or anaphylaxis, and in rare cases, fatality can result. So many of you may be asking the question, what exactly is an invasive species? The United States Department of Agriculture defines invasive species as plants, animals, or pathogens that are non-native or alien to an ecosystem and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause environmental harm or harm to human health. Prior to joining Alabama State University, my work as the regional coordinator with the IR4 Specialty Crops Program based at the University of Florida saw me travel to various agricultural sites throughout the U.S. In the South, the threat of invasive species is a particularly poignant one as our agricultural industries, while delicately balanced, are powerful. Agriculture, food, and related industries contribute over $1 trillion to the U.S. GDP in 2017, according to the USDA Economic Research Service. Invasive species present significant threats to global agriculture, and as the U.S. is among the biggest agricultural programs, we are at risk for the greatest cost from invasive species. Invasive plants and animals are successful because they eat or outcompete native species by damaging habitats or by spreading disease. Most invasive species are successful largely because they have no natural predators in their introduced environments. Much of what we know about this insect's biology are from the scientific literature, largely on studies that were done in Japan. There is certainly a need to do basic biology studies so that we can learn more about the behavior of this insect in our domiciles. It's important that we get a handle on this threat before the insect establishes and wreaks havoc and further damage on our already at-risk honeybee populations. We know that the hornet can decapitate entire broods of honeybees as they feed dead prey to their own young. We need to be able to accurately predict impact on the future and design policies that are proactive and appropriate. A rapid response is essential to tackling invasive species, and this requires adequate resources for scientists, researchers, and stakeholders alike to be able to mobilize as needed and to be able to conduct research efforts that will lead to eradication. One of the most important keys to prevent spread and eventual establishment is surveillance. And this grant program that will be established by HR 6761 will provide an avenue for affected states to have access to resources that will be needed for eradication efforts. Thank you for the opportunity to address the subcommittee on this very important issue. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, and I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Doctor. The chair now recognizes Mr. Batchelor for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member McClintock, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Gordon Batchelor, retired Chief Wildlife Biologist for the state of New York. Today, I'm speaking on behalf of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. We represent state and provincial fish and wildlife agencies to ensure they have the authorities and resources needed to conserve fish and wildlife. The purpose of the Bear Protection Act is to, quote, conserve global bear populations by prohibiting the trade of bear viscera. For practical purposes, this means bear gallbladders. There are 8 species of bear. 3 occur in North America: the American black bear, brown bear, which includes grizzly bears, and polar bears. On this issue, the species of primary concern are the Asiatic black bear and the American black bear. Bear gallbladders have known medical value. The bile contains a chemical I'll call urso, used for 3,000 years to treat many diseases, including liver disease and colon cancer, and has been a revered medical component in Asian medicine for many years. The use of bear gallbladders is closely linked to the Asiatic black bear, a species that requires strong conservation measures to secure their populations. The trade in gallbladders from the Asiatic black bear is largely limited to and within Asian countries. HR 2264 is identical to a bill considered by the 110th Congress in 2008, HR 3029. That hearing summarized the top needs for bear conservation in Asia. 1, survey of portions of the geographic range where the continued existence of bears is unknown. 2, obtaining information on bear population trends. 3, conducting direct on-the-ground conservation work, including law enforcement, on issues affecting bears in Asia. And 4, addressing and studying the bear farming issue. The key finding from that expert testimony in 2008 is that the worldwide conservation issues involving bears are very complex and require both support and funding. A prohibition on the trade of gallbladders is not considered vital by the experts to conserving at-risk bear species. The bill could have unintended consequences by growing the unregulated black market for bear gallbladders. An approach focused on appropriate regulation of this trade through existing international controls established in the CITES Treaty seems more sensible. The American black bear is abundant and secure, and populations are growing in many states. There are between 400 and 500,000 black bears in the United States. To balance bear populations with human needs, our key tools are regulated hunting, allowed by 31 states, public education, research, and monitoring. 27 states allow the gifting of black bear gallbladders, and 7 allow their sale and trade. The Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies strongly supports the authorities of individual states to tailor laws and regulations on bear conservation, including the use or sale of bear parts to fit their individual circumstances and needs. We do not see a conservation benefit associated with a federal role in this arena. There is another concern. The medical value of bear gallbladders is legitimate. There is growing scientific evidence that those benefits may have been underestimated. New research finds that the active ingredients of bear gallbladder may provide treatment for a wider range of serious diseases than previously understood. The bill would jeopardize this line of scientific inquiry by drying up the supply of bear tissues for medical research by precluding interstate transfer of tissues for study. A more effective conservation strategy is to increase resources available to nations that harbor species at risk. Regarding H.R. 1776, the Captive Primate Safety Act, we are deeply concerned that this bill strikes the term state licensed wildlife rehabilitators from current law, which would stop state licensed rehabilitators from caring for the listed species. These experts, largely volunteers, are highly trained animal caregivers and important to state fish and wildlife agencies. We agree with the important need to eradicate murder hornets, and we support funding for that initiative. We suggest respectfully to the subcommittee that funding should be directed to the USGS Patuxent Wildlife Research Center because of their strong expertise in these matters. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Batchelor. The chair now recognizes Mr. Sutton for 5 minutes. Welcome, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me to testify regarding the Bear Protection Act, the Captive Primate Safety Act, and the Murder Hornet Eradication Act. My name is Michael Sutton. I'm speaking to you this morning from Carmel Valley in California. Spent my entire career working in wildlife conservation. Over the years, I've served as a national park ranger, a special agent with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and more recently as president of the California Fish and Game Commission. In these roles, I've worked all over the world to stem the illegal trade in wildlife, including bear parts, rhino horn, elephant ivory, shark fins, and rare plants. This trade is every bit as lucrative as the narcotics trade, but the penalties are a slap on the wrist by comparison. During my years as a park ranger and federal wildlife agent, I witnessed firsthand the extent and impact of the trade in bear parts and other wildlife across the nation. We are literally engaged in a war on wildlife, and the animals are losing the battle. I'd like to make 3 quick points about the Bear Protection Act. Number 1, the illegal wildlife trade threatens bears right here in North America and across the world. Almost a decade ago, Mr. Huffman and I worked together with our fellow Californians to shut down the trade in shark fins in our state. That trade contributes to the decline of world shark populations, just like the bear trade. The trade in bear parts decimates bear populations. For centuries, bears have been exploited for their parts and products such as gallbladders and bile. Bear gallbladders command a high price on the black market, in some cases more than $1,000 each, because of the demand for them in traditional Chinese medicine. As a result of this trade, all 8 of the world's bear species are protected under the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species known as CITES. But that treaty, which is the world's largest conservation agreement in more than 180 signatory countries, doesn't work by itself. Countries like the United States have to enact their own legislation to protect these animals. Brings me to my second point. States alone cannot protect bears from the harmful impacts of the global wildlife trade. I've tracked poachers killing bears in American forests and pursued wildlife traffickers illegally moving bear parts from Idaho through Washington into Canada. Poachers and wildlife traffickers exploit our patchwork of state laws to find gaps through which they can trade in bear parts. 40 states have laws on the books to address this trade, but these laws vary widely state to state. For example, a trafficker in Colorado might face up to 3 years in prison and a $100,000 fine, but somebody selling a bear gallbladder in Kentucky may receive only a $100 fine. And in other states, it's perfectly legal to sell parts and products from lawfully taken bears. As a federal wildlife agent, I participated in undercover operations where a large number of people were involved in sophisticated, multi-state bear smuggling operations. I saw firsthand how lenient laws in some states promote and encourage bear poaching. I support the efforts of the states to strengthen their laws, but the federal government cannot afford to be a bystander when it comes to fighting this trade. That brings me to my third and final point. The need for congressional action is clear. When the federal government and the states are aligned, we send a powerful signal to poachers and global wildlife traffickers that we have zero tolerance for this conduct. We all watched for decades as the trade in elephant ivory and rhino horn and tiger bone contributed to the steep decline in those species throughout their range. Let's not wait until we can no longer find bears in the wild before adopting consistent state and federal policies against a lethal practice that really has no legitimate purpose. Trading in bear parts is neither ethical nor sportsmanlike, and frankly, it's not a legitimate industry. Congress should give it no quarter. Let me turn now to the Captive Primate Safety Act, which seeks to promote animal welfare, protect the public health and safety by prohibiting interstate commerce in monkeys, chimpanzees, and other primates as pets. Simply put, primates are wild animals and should not be kept as pets. They can inflict serious injuries and spread life-threatening diseases. The average pet owner cannot provide the care they need in captivity. More than 24 states prohibit keeping primates as pets, but many others do not. And while no one can legally import primates into the United States as pets, they're readily available for purchase from exotic animal breeders and dealers, even online. The Captive Primate Safety Act will add non-human primates to the list of animals that can't be transported across state lines as pets. The legislation is narrowly focused on the pet trade. It would have no impact on zoos, research institutions, or responsible wildlife sanctuaries. Trade in primates as pets is dangerous. They can inflict serious injuries on people, as you've seen, and they carry diseases and parasites that can be transmitted to humans. Don't forget the deadly Ebola virus likely was first transmitted to people in Africa from non-humans. But by prohibiting interstate commerce, it will discourage the trade and help protect the animals and the community. Like the Bear Protection Act, this measure will complement state laws and sets a bright line national policy that keeping primates as pets is unacceptable. Finally, I'd like to signal my support. You can imagine the impact on agriculture in the United States if honeybees were eradicated. Giant hornets aside, honeybees face so many threats today that many farmers here in California and other states are compelled to pay beekeepers to place their hives in orchards and fields so the bees can pollinate their crops. The Chairman's Murder Hornet Eradication Act would allow the federal government to provide assistance for research aimed at documenting the danger posed by this invasive species to both industry and public health and determine ways to meet that challenge.
Thank you, Mr.
The
Sutton.
opportunity to testify on these important bills.
Thank you very much. Want to thank all the panelists for their testimony and remind members that under Committee Rule 3D, there is a 5-minute limit on questions. We will now recognize members for their questions of the witnesses, and I will start with myself. And Mr. Sutton, I'd like to begin with you. We heard from Mr. Batchelor that there is actual medical value in these bear gallbladders, and he is worried that the Bear Protection Act would have the unintended consequence of making apparently a valuable medical substance unavailable. Our committee staff report, at least on the Democratic side, suggests that the substance in bear bile that seems to have some proven medical value actually can be manufactured synthetically, and so that there may not be an actual need to have the gallbladder, that we can produce the same stuff. Wonder if you could just speak to that issue. And then while you're on the Bear Protection Act, I wonder if you could also just elaborate a little further on why you think the demand and market for bear bile would pose a major threat, not just to the Asian bear populations, but potentially to U.S. bear populations?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As far as I know, there is no proven medical value to bear bile. It's true that this substance, like many wildlife products, has been used for centuries in the traditional Chinese medicine, but that doesn't mean it necessarily has proven medical value. We know for a fact that the trade in bear parts, along with many other wildlife products for traditional medicine, has enormous impact on wildlife populations around the world. A bear gallbladder, once the gall is reduced to a part, it's very difficult to tell whether it's from a species in Asia or North America or Europe. And so our feeling when I was with the Fish and Wildlife Service was that the legal trade in bear parts in any part of the world threatens bears all over the world. So and this was true of elephant ivory and many other wildlife products as well. The trade in one part of the world, any legal trade, encourages poaching and illegal trade in other parts of the world.
All right, thank you. Ms. Ziemer, I'd like to turn to you, please. I can appreciate how managed aquifer recharge will be a new use of surface water that we need to explore for various beneficial uses, but it's also a new use that has to be balanced against existing uses, especially in places where surface water supplies are already strained. And so I want to ask you about the Idaho model that you have been so engaged in. I know that Trout Unlimited is on an Idaho Environmental Technical Working Group in the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. I'd like to ask you to discuss how you have gone about making recommendations on planned aquifer recharge activities in Idaho, whether you think that is a model for other basins, and how federal resources should support that type of work, please.
Excellent question, Chairman Huffman. Thank you. One of the reasons that the working group works so well in Idaho is that it has a formal charter that was agreed to in a memorandum of understanding to settle the state of Idaho's aquifer recharge water rights. And that charter provides the diverse membership to use a named member along with other fisheries interests like the Henry's Fork Foundation and the Idaho Fish and Game. There's regular meetings and a charter to take into consideration those fisheries and water quality values of water that are often not protected by water rights. And so to have that formal charter, to have the regular process of meeting really makes a chance to build relationships and to test drive new approaches. I think that's a easily exportable model that would work very well in other states. And even though I think it's most successful as a state-led effort with this multi-stakeholder group, federal resources, as you suggest, I think would be incredibly helpful to making the working groups in other states and in Idaho very effective. Group and meeting facilitation and and importantly, support for data collection and monitoring, I think would all go a long way to supporting successful efforts like Idaho's in other states.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Batchelor, H.R. 1776 is framed as a measure to protect pet owners from being attacked by their pet monkeys, but it goes much farther than that, does it not?
Well, the concern we have is the specific striking of the term state licensed wildlife rehabilitators. And those are generally volunteers licensed and regulated by state agencies throughout the country, and they provide important services, including for those species listed in the underlying legislation, including cougars, for example. States throughout this country deal with problem situations involving confiscated pets, and we need a place with trained personnel to take care of those pets while the law enforcement cases are adjudicated. So the striking of that term is very problematic.
Aren't abused primates taken in and cared for by the facilities would be affected by this bill?
Well, the legislation that the bill seeks to amend includes other species that are listed, including cougars, for example. So that's the concern, that it inadvertently perhaps causes a difficult problem involving the disposition of confiscated pet animals, including primates, but other
In
species.
fact, in fact, it would prohibit all zoos and animal preserves that are regulated and licensed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, including members of the Zoological Association of America. That includes professionally managed zoos, aquaria, conservation breeding facilities, wildlife conservation ranches, and conservation-based animal ambassador programs, does it not?
That's my understanding. And again, you know, the inadvertent consequence, perhaps not understood when the bill was drafted, striking state licensed wildlife rehabilitators really takes away an important tool that states have.
Thank you. Turning to the bill on bear viscera, we're told we need to act to prohibit this trade before the bear populations in America disappear. Are our bear populations disappearing?
Every state that has resident bears, black bears, reports that the bear populations are stable or increasing. Many states report increasing. So black bears are thriving, they're very abundant. Poaching, while reprehensible, and poaching for whatever reason is reprehensible, it is not a factor in the population status of the American black bear in the United States. So actions pertaining to bear viscera, bear gallbladder for black bears in the United States are going to be absolutely inconsequential. I
Well,
do
that's why
think the committee.
I was going to say, that's why we provide a regulated environment for this because that provides the avenue of least resistance, making poaching much more dangerous and risky. You remove that regulated trade, that makes poaching the only game in town, does it not?
Well, as you know, some states have chosen to prohibit the trade in bear parts. New York, in our case, we allow it, but there must be a chain of custody. So the
Right.
bear parts that are traded have to be identified. So if you find one without a chain of custody verification, it's contraband and then prosecuted. Other states have taken a different route, but the bottom line is bear populations in the U.S. are very secure.
So the unintended consequence of this bill is likely to increase poaching because that then forces all of that demand into an underground market.
That is the concern. You know, when you make something illegal, it doesn't necessarily remove the demand for the product. It just drives it underground, and it has been inferred by others. This black market is tied up in other things, narcotics, for example. So we feel as states, it's better to regulate and monitor than to prohibit if there's not a population consequence, as there is no consequence in this case for black bears.
We just received testimony that there's no proven medical value to bear viscera. Didn't you testify that this bill would make it impossible to even research the medical value of this product?
The difficulty is, yes, the difficulty is the movement and supply of product to researchers. And there's really little question, though I'm not a biochemist, that there is proven medical benefits of this tissue. For the convenience of the subcommittee, in my written testimony, I appended a recent scientific publication from the University of Minnesota citing not only the current understanding of the benefits, but the innovative research that's being done to learn about new benefits associated with bear gallbladder. So it's very real. There's no question about that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Case for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Samuel Fu, I'd like to turn back, please, to Chair Grijalva's HR 6761 and speak to you about that a little bit. And I am a co-sponsor of this bill and very supportive of this bill, not only because I understand and fully appreciate the concern of the introduction of this invasive into our population and the threat it poses not only to the native bee population, but to United States agriculture because of its role as a pollinator, but because of my own concerns for my state of Hawaii, which we also often refer to not in good terms as the invasive species capital of the world, where we have many of the endangered species throughout our country. And the reason is primarily because of invasive species coming in and taking them out. For example, we have somewhere around 7 endemic bee populations that pollinate endemic plant populations. So if you take out our bee populations, you're going to take out the plant populations because they're interlinked and endemic. This particular bill goes to a much broader problem, of course, which is how do we prevent and deal with invasive species. And so I wanted to ask, in your experience, how does this bill specifically link in with our general approach to invasive species through the Department of Interior as an agency in the National Invasive Species Council, and further support our early detection and rapid response program? How will this bill amplify that, supplement it with this particular issue?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Case. The bill is going to be important because it's going to provide resources that are needed by the states that are going to be affected. The researchers, the entomologists, the scientists, even the citizen scientists that will take a role in early surveillance and early detection that will enable us to act and to react quickly so that we can, first of all, detect and decide whether these Asian giant hornets have in fact been established. We don't know for certain. There's a lot of uncertainty. We've only had 3 sightings that have been reported so far, but there are probably others that have gone undetected. So having funding and resources available for those individuals that are at the forefront to do their work, to locate the nests and to put in place the programs for trapping and eradication is going to be of paramount importance.
Okay, and then, I mean, what about just the practicality of this? I'm thinking about timing, for example, and cost benefit. On the timing side, once an invasive species is detected, you must have a certain period of time when you can work to eradicate it, but after that time has passed, it's a lot harder. And then what is the cost benefit of the investment through this bill? I mean, if we spend X amount of money, we avoid Y amount of damage to U.S. agriculture. What's your analysis of that?
Well, I think that if we go with the approach of early detection, we don't know yet whether the populations have had a chance to firmly establish in the U.S. And so this is a good thing. We are approaching this problem from proactively. We're approaching it from the forefront before the colonies might have a chance to establish widespread throughout the U.S. We know for right now that we've only had instances or sightings detected in Washington state. While it's unlikely that the populations can travel so quickly to establish in other states, particularly in the South or even the Midwest, if we can keep that localized and control the eradication efforts in that particular area, we are likely to be very successful. And as we know, U.S. agriculture is a major contributor to the U.S. economy, our national GDP. And so this is going to provide a tremendous benefit to all of us. When you walk into your local grocery store and you see a preponderance of fresh fruits and vegetables that are available for you to purchase as a consumer, a lot of this is because of the efforts of our farmers, our honeybee as natural pollinators. And we all know about the health benefits that derive from having a well-balanced diet. So if we have a threat to our honeybees in particular, and honeybees are under threat anyway because of colony collapse disorder, climate change, there are a lot of factors that are affecting honeybees anyway. And whatever we can do to help further protect these very important species is going to be really important for us to do.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you, Mr. Case. The chair now recognizes the architect of potato diplomacy, the gentleman from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've got a question. I'd like to get some clarification from Mr. Batchelor, if I may, in regard to HR 2264. Mr. Batchelor, I just wanted to confirm and get your insight in regard to the bill on decreasing global demand for bear parts, that this does not conflict with existing state guidelines on hunting and legal harvesting for the black bear? I know in our state, the grizzly is already protected, endangered species. That's a hot topic in a lot of areas. The black bear is not. And I just want to get your insight on that issue, please.
So each state that has a black bear population and a hunting season makes a decision about appropriate season dates, season timing, season chronology, methods of take, and then what you can do with the bear afterwards. I think all states prohibit the sale of bear meat. Some states allow the sale of bear hides or a bear skull, for which there's a market. And a small number of states, I believe it's 7, allow the sale of bear gallbladders. I mentioned New York State. We allow it for commercial purposes, but there has to be a chain of custody. Other states don't specify the requirement for a chain of custody. A majority of states that have bear hunting allow the gifting of a bear gallbladder. So for example, if a hunter in New York shot a bear, I could gift it to a person that needs that medicinal benefit in another state. So it's not a sale, but it's a transfer from one state to another. And so the law, the bill would prohibit that transfer, that interstate transfer. So we're troubled by the the federal footprint there that would interfere with existing or contemplated state regulations. And I think it's important for as mentioned by Mr. McClintock, the unintended consequence of forcing things underground and then losing control of the ability to regulate that activity. The demand is going to be there because, as I mentioned, the proven medicinal value of this product in bear gallbladders is real, and there's cutting edge research right now suggesting that the benefits are more significant than previously realized. So even without the hunting issue, setting that aside for a moment, being able to share tissues from one state to another for research purposes is important.
So, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Batchelor, just to be clear, you don't see any direct conflict with the existing legal harvesting. It's the transfer of and the sale of the parts, which is not currently an issue at the state level.
Right. The legislation would truncate state authority in determining the appropriate regulatory regime for what happens after a hunter takes a bear. What can they do with it? Right now, there's an accommodation for these products by some states. And so we believe it's appropriate for each state in their own circumstance to make that determination. We also strongly support the efforts of law enforcement at the state and federal level to apprehend illegal activity. And we're involved in many law enforcement initiatives to do that. And as I mentioned in my testimony, the real need is funding and resources to step up enforcement activities, particularly in Asia, where they have, frankly, rudimentary management controls for regulated activities. The marketing of bear gallbladders in those countries is already not allowed in the case of the wild bears, but they need enforcement resources. The CITES Treaty already controls how these products are imported and exported. They need enforcement, capacity. Basically, we share the concern about Asiatic black bears, but there are much bigger problems that need to be addressed beyond the gallbladder issue. It's everything from habitat conditions to just fundamental understanding of what the population status of the species is. As I mentioned, in North America, the black bear population is very secure and growing. No question about that. Bear poaching on black bears is inconsequential.
Thank you, Mr. Batchelor. Mr. Chairman, yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Chair, and I have some questions for Mr. Sutton on the Captive Primate Safety Act of HR 2776. I need some greater understanding about what we're going to be doing with these captive primates once we return them, once they come out of private ownership. I think that would be one of the goals. And I want to thank you, Mr. Sutton, for being here and your testimony. With only about a dozen accredited primate sanctuaries in the United States and estimated tens of thousands of primates kept as pets, can you tell us about the financial implications of sanctuaries taking on primates from private pet owners? Does sanctuary provide a realistic and sustainable solution for the pet trade issue? And what happens to former pets who cannot be rehomed to a legitimate sanctuary?
Thank you very much for that question. As I understand the legislation, it does not forbid keeping primates as pets. It does not outlaw the keeping of primates as pets, but rather prohibits interstate commerce to discourage the trade in these animals and protect both the animals and the community. And there are sanctuaries set up that are privately operated, that are funded by various animal welfare organizations that can take some of these animals. The problem is that in many cases, private owners that own these pets are incapable of providing a proper housing for them and thereby allow the animals to inflict both serious injuries and spread life-threatening diseases. The average pet owner simply can't provide the care they need in captivity. The bill, however, would not force existing pet owners to give up primates, but simply would outlaw interstate commerce in these animals. As you know, import is already illegal, but there are thousands of primates already in private hands around the country, and it's easy to obtain a pet primate in interstate commerce today. We think that's very dangerous and would contribute to both a decline in the care and the animal welfare of these animals and threaten public health and safety.
Thank you for that, Coach. I have one more question. Mr. Sutton, following an assessment by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and other researchers, about 75% of the wild primate populations are declining. Does the U.S. primate pet trade have a role in this decline? And if so, can you describe how the U.S. primate pet trade is connected to the global population decline?
That's a great question. The trade in wildlife, and primates are no exception, has enormous consequences for wild populations. As you know, primates are traded all over the world, not just for pets, but by zoos, by research institutions for testing of vaccines and so forth. This bill would not impact the ability of legitimate research and zoological organizations to acquire primates, but rather is targeted narrowly at the pet trade. But there's no question that in many parts of the world, the pet trade contributes to the decline of these species in the wild. I visited, many years ago, I visited the Amazon, where U.S. Pet traders were buying monkeys from the jungle, from the people who lived in the jungle, and shipping them out to the U.S. and other countries. In fact, the demand was so great at that time that there was an island in the Amazon River where monkeys were actually taken and bred for the pet trade. So this can have enormous consequences on wild populations. But again, the bill is narrowly targeted only at the pet trade and only interstate commerce. We've already prohibited the importation of primates for the pet trade.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I want to take a moment to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement in favor of the Bear Protection Act. The statement is from a great wildlife champion, Senator Mitch McConnell, from July 7th, 1998 at the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. Without objection, I will enter that into the record, and we'll recognize Mr. Gianforte for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get to my questions, I just want to note Mr. Fulcher's passionate advocacy for Idaho potatoes. And they are truly famous potatoes. But for the record, I would like the record to show that, in fact, many of the Idaho potatoes come from Montana seed potato growers. And it would be more accurate to say famous potatoes from Montana. So thank you for continuing to promote them. Mrs. Ziemer, it's a pleasure to have a Montanan here. And I think you understand the challenges facing our friends on the High Line. The users of the St. Mary's system have one of the highest cost shares in the nation. My question for you is, how would flipping the cost share help the users bring the system into the 21st century? I think you need to turn your mic on.
Sorry. Excellent question, Representative Gianforte. Thank you. And you're quite right that that high cost share for the High Line and Milk River users of greater than 50% is really out of line with other federal reclamation projects. And as you suggest, flipping that cost share, I think, is appropriate in this circumstance, not only because of the long history of that Milk River Canal and the Milk River project, but because of the importance of incorporating the new diversion structure and fish screen at the St. Mary's Canal diversion. And the increased federal cost share will make that multi-benefit project more capable of being implemented at this time when drops 5 and 2 are also addressed, so that all 3 priority projects can be completed at once while the canal is out of commission this season. I think it really, the speed and importance of including all 3 projects really argues for that increased cost share.
Okay, thank you. And you and I both know that the state of Montana has authorized $10 million to the project contingent on the federal government agreeing to this new cost share, as well as having the funds count towards the irrigators users portion. Could these funds be used on a portion of the project like drops 2 and 5 and the diversion to satisfy the state's requirements?
Yes, that makes perfect sense.
Okay. And my last question, between the litigation over the diversion because of the concerns over the bull trout that are in the St. Mary's and in the St. Mary's River and the catastrophic failure of drop 5, the cost to rehab this project is really untenable for the users at the current cost share. Could you briefly touch on the impacts to the communities if we don't actually rehab the project?
You're so right to bring that up, Representative Gianforte, because as you noted, this project is different than many other reclamation projects because it provides not only key irrigation water, but also is the sole supply of drinking water for the town of Havre as well as for the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. And because it supplies that essential drinking water, I think that puts this particular project in a slightly different category of providing essential services.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gianforte. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Grijalva, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, some folks are arguing that the discussion about the Asian giant hornets and this legislation, that they're currently not a non-issue. Could you explain to the subcommittee the risks associated? I think you elaborate on them because you have spoken to it. If we neglect to eradicate the Asian giant hornet in the United States now and begin that process and along the U.S.-Canadian border. Dr. Samuel?
Potential one at this point because it's early in the process of detection. Having said that, now is the ideal time for us to invoke an eradication program, detection and eradication. For a program like this to be successful, we want to be sure that we are having workers on the ground to conduct the surveillance that's necessary to find out if, in fact, we have more than just these 3 reported findings. Why is this important? We know for a fact it's been well established that the Asian giant hornet prefers honeybees as a food source. They will feed on other species, but for some reason that's unclear at this point in time. Once we have a large colony established, they switch to mainly honeybees as their main food supply. Honeybees are very important pollinators for U.S. agriculture. We know that in states like California, for instance, honeybees are shipped to be able to pollinate our almond industry, for instance. That industry would be severely impacted and face the potential of being wiped out if there were not enough honeybees to pollinate the plants. Because the Asian giant hornet is now one of a string of additional threats to honeybees, they're under threat from colony collapse disorder. There's some pesticides that negatively affect the honeybees. There's climate change. There's a whole host of threats to honeybees. We need to be able to do whatever we can to control this potential threat from the Asian giant hornet as early as possible.
Thank you very much. Let me, one other follow-up question, more of a general theme, as, invasive species are one of the top threats to biodiversity, yet our management of them is very patchwork. There's no cohesive strategy. What would be some of your recommendations for taking a more holistic approach at the federal level to deal with invasive species as a whole?
I think one of the most important things that we can do first and foremost is to make the resources available. I applaud the idea of a grant program. This means that those entomologists, for instance, if we're speaking specifically about the Asian giant hornet, these are the individuals that have expertise in this particular area. And so they can work hand in hand with other extension workers or other authorities to figure out what are going to be the best strategies for control. We need a framework that's going to be such that we have all of the most important players speaking to each other, so that if there is a colony or a threat that's detected in one particular state, the individuals in the neighboring states also have access to that information. So we need a framework, we need a system in place so that information is going to be very easy to be channeled from one individual or from one area to the next, so that neighboring states or states that have the potential to be affected in the future can be aware of what these threats are, and so that they can enact policies or procedures that will be in place to negate that particular threat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for the hearing, and yield back.
And thank you, Chairman Grijalva. So at this point, I don't have any other members identified in the queue, but let me just ask for those who are logged in and participating remotely, are there any other members who would like to ask questions? If so, we'll need you to indicate that desire at this time. Seeing none, I think I want to bring us to a close by thanking the staff who have worked really hard to make this hybrid hearing possible. Yes, sir.
Before we do that, may I get unanimous consent to place in the record 3 letters, one from the Feline Conservation Foundation opposing H.R. 1776, citing the same concerns that Mr. Batchelor mentioned earlier. The Zoological Association of America that would be devastated by H.R. 1776, also in opposition, and the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation in opposition to H.R. 2264.
Without objection, those will be placed in the record. So thanks again to staff. Nobody likes this pandemic. Nobody likes the fact that we have all these workarounds in order to do the work of this committee, but I think staff is doing a better job every single time that we conduct one of these hybrid hearings. And while it's not quite a substitute for everybody being here in person, I feel like we're doing our part during this pandemic with the technology, the social distancing, and the masks. And in that regard, I want to thank all the members as well. I really appreciate your complying with the safety and decorum rules today. It got us through this hearing safely. And with that, I want to thank also the witnesses who participated in the panels. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for our witnesses, and we will ask them to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the subcommittee must submit written questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days to allow for responses. If there's no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.